Good morning. We start with breaking news. It's just crossing. Paul Kelso has it for us. What is the inflation?
The inflation figure for July, year-on-year, 3.8%. That is an increase of 0.2 percentage points from 3.6 in June. It's a little above the consensus forecast of economists, which was 3.7%. It's in line with forecasts. It's expected, is what the Bank of England expects to happen, but unwelcome nonetheless. Just looking at this bulletin from the Office for National Statistics, they say airfares and transport costs are a significant factor in this increase. What I am looking for as well, while we're on, and perhaps a colleague can help us, is the figure for retail price inflation, which may end up setting rail fares.
Which is 4.8, and the expectation for RPI was 4.5. As you say, RPI is what tends to feed into things like rail fares. Also, by the way, the rate and payout on things like inflation-linked bonds, it affects government costs more and consumer costs more.
Exactly, and when it comes to the consumer costs, and particularly rail fares, the government hasn't said how it will work out rail fare increases yet. Last year it took RPI plus 1%. They haven't made a decision yet. Travel groups, commuter groups have already pointed out it would be outrageous. That would be, what are we talking? Did you say 4.8%? So between 5, nearly 6% rail fare increase for a largely public-owned network. That would be a lot. So we'll see how that goes. But these figures, as I say, build on the expectations of the direction of travel for inflation. One thing I'll be looking at, and we'll get more on, is what's happened to food inflation. Food inflation, having fallen below that overall headline rate of inflation earlier in the year, is now, certainly was in June, advancing above the overall rate of inflation, and everyone is feeling that in their shopping basket.
A few more numbers here just to touch on. Core CPI, 3.8. The expectation was 3.7. Perhaps more strikingly, services inflation coming in at 5%. The expectation there was 4.8. But if you bring it back to the overall headline number again, Paul, CPI, just to remind our viewers, at 3.8%. The target is 2%. Now, this isn't the 11% we saw at the peak of the Ukraine invasion, but it is the highest level since January 2024. It continues a trend. May 3.4, June 3.6, July 3.7. So inflation is rising again. It is enough, it's high enough that it really affects people, even if it's not double digits. And we just cut interest rates, the Bank of England. So I do think it's a really interesting position that we're in, where, why is the Bank of England cutting interest rates? Because they're worried about the labour market, they're worried about the economy, yet inflation is well above their forecasts. And so this just shows that the tough position that's emerging for the short term, the months ahead.
Absolutely, and the bank, remember, when it made that decision, they had to vote twice for the first time ever because they were concerned about inflation. So these are difficult decisions for the bank. I mean, more pressing is the impact on consumers. I've got the food inflation number here. 4.9% food is increasing, so, and people do feel that. This is evidence of what the Bank of England talked about for a long time. So remember, inflation did fall back, that 11% peak off the back of the Ukraine war, which pushed up fuel, energy, food prices enormously. It did dip back to around 2%, but that was essentially a statistical working through of those really high prices disappearing from the calculations, because this is year-on-year numbers. And what we're seeing now is what the bank always worried about, which was that that inflation will become sticky, embedded in the economy. And those two underlying numbers, core CPI, and particularly services, that's the bulk of the British economy is services, that is what concerns them. So I think we were in a period slightly earlier this year where it felt like perhaps there'd be every 2 meetings of the Bank of England, every quarter roughly, interest rates would come down. That feels like it's on pause at the moment while they work out where the economy is heading. So the bank expects inflation to peak at 4% later this year and then fall back in the year that follows. But that's slim consolation as prices for everything go up.
Just to round it off, last week, obviously, GDP data was better than expected for the government, quite a lot better than expected, and we gave that credit whilst it's due. This inflation print is worse than expected, and I think that the sort of added headache for the government in the short term as you approach the October budget is that it means rate cuts, which help them a bit, might help the GDP number a bit in the months ahead. Rate cuts in the short term look unlikely when you're at 3.8%.
And it was striking last week when we had those numbers, which were still a slowing of growth, but growth nonetheless. The first thing the Chancellor pointed to when she welcomed those numbers was cuts by the Bank of England, over which he has no control. And you're absolutely right. If that's not bringing any relief to the third of people who have mortgages and perhaps the third of landlords who might be using high rates to push up costs to their renters. Inflation is the one, right? It hits people in their pockets for all the direction of travel of the economy, whatever statistics might be away. What matters, I think certainly as far as the government, is are people feeling it in their pocket? And what rising inflation, particularly for food, for fuel, for things we pay for every day, that hits them in their pocket. So this is hard. And we'll get more reaction and we'll get some more detail on what underlies these numbers as the morning goes on.